In the fall of 1941, deep in the remote forests of British Columbia, the Chapman family lived a quiet life, surrounded by the untouched wilderness. But one crisp autumn morning, their peaceful existence was shattered by an encounter so terrifying it forced them to flee their home. For centuries, local native tribes spoke of large, mysterious creatures roaming these woods, beings they called Sasquatch. These stories, passed down through generations, were often dismissed as mere myth. But on that fateful day, the Chapmans came face to face with something straight out of those ancient tales. This is the chilling story of the Ruby Creek incident, where folklore took a step into reality. George and Jeannie Chapman lived a quiet life in Ruby Creek, raising their 3 children away from the bustle of city life. George worked on the railroad, while Jeannie tended to their home, a life defined by simplicity and routine. Nestled in their small house on the edge of the vast British Columbia wilderness, the Chapman family had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. That was until Jeannie's eldest son burst through the door, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. It had been a clear, crisp afternoon, and he had been playing outside with his siblings. He claimed that there was a big cow walking out of the woods. Jeannie, momentarily puzzled, tried to calm him. But something in his tone, an edge of genuine terror, made her heart flutter. She set down her work and stepped outside, her eyes scanning the sunlit landscape, trying to find this cow that her son had seen. And then she saw it. Standing just beyond the edge of the clearing was not a cow, but a massive, upright figure. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, covered in thick hair. The sunlight filtered through the trees behind it, casting a yellow-brown glow that seemed to outline its shape. The creature was enormous, taller than any man Jeannie had ever seen. Its arms hung long, and its posture, though odd, had a strangely human quality to it. It simply stood there, observing its surroundings, its dark, amber eyes catching the light as they glinted in the afternoon sun. Jeannie's body went rigid, caught in a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It felt like one of the stories her parents used to tell her when she was a child. But this wasn't a story. It was real. And then it hit her. This wasn't a man, and it wasn't a bear. This had to be a Sasquatch. Suddenly, the creature began to move toward the house. It moved slowly, but with an incredible sense of purpose. Its gait was unlike anything Jeannie had ever seen. Each stride was unbelievably long, covering vast stretches of ground in what seemed like just a few steps. It had already crossed the tree line and entered the field, moving with a grace and power that defied its size. It wasn't rushing, yet it covered the distance so quickly that Jeannie could hardly believe it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched it approach. Panic surged through her veins. Yet, Jeannie stood still, frozen, watching as the creature drew closer, the sunlight revealing more details as it advanced from the shadow of the tree line. The more she saw, the more her heart pounded in her chest. She tried to gauge its height, using the fence posts scattered across the field as reference points. It was huge. It must have been at the very least 7.5 feet tall. Its head was small in proportion to its body, and its neck was barely noticeable, thick and short, almost no neck at all. The creature's body was massive, like a human's, but unnaturally thick through the chest. Its arms hung down impossibly long, the kind of length you'd expect to see on a creature of far greater size. The sight was so wrong, it felt like her mind was having trouble processing it. She couldn't see its feet, hidden in the grass, but she noticed its shoulders. They were unnervingly wide. And though she didn't see any other defining characteristics, the absence of breasts made her assume it was male, though its groin was covered in long hair. The most chilling detail, however, was its face and hands. The exposed skin was a dark, almost black color, a stark contrast to the lighter fur covering its body. Suddenly, Jeannie's instincts kicked in. She stood her ground even as the creature continued its deliberate approach. Her eldest son, on her command, rushed to get a blanket from inside and gather the other children. It took him a couple of minutes, and during that time, the creature had crossed the field, closing the gap to just about 100 feet from her. As soon as her son returned with the blanket, Jeannie acted without hesitation. She spread it out swiftly, holding it high to shield the children. Every step she took was deliberate, though her mind raced with fear. The thought that the creature might be after one of them consumed her, making it harder to hold on to her composure. Terror coursed through her veins, but she knew she had to stay strong for the children. Yet, she clung to a faint, irrational hope. If the creature believed they were still inside the house, it might focus its attention there, giving them a chance to escape. With the blanket securely wrapped around the children, she retreated toward the old field. She stole a glance over her shoulder. The creature had indeed made its way into the house. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm, suppressing the rising panic. She had to stay composed, to keep moving forward, one careful step at a time. She tried to make sense of the creature's behavior, but there was no time for analysis. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to keep moving, to get as far away from the house as possible. Her feet carried her toward the river beach, the weight of the moment settling in as the distance between her and the house grew. But then, just as she thought they might be out of danger, she heard it. A series of guttural whoops, followed by strange, deep, gurgling whistle that seemed to vibrate through the air. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard before. It sent a shiver down her spine, signaling that the creature was still near, still aware of their presence. Jeannie quickened her pace, pulling the children along, heading downstream toward the village. The further they moved, the more she felt the weight of what had happened pressing on her. When they finally reached the village, she allowed herself to pause, but only briefly. It wasn't until she stood there, safely within the village's limits, that she became fully aware of how much her body was trembling. George Chapman returned home from his shift on the railroad that evening, around 6 o'clock, taking a route that bypassed the village. He was unaware of anything unusual until he reached his house. Upon walking into his field, he immediately thought that something was wrong. The house was silent and dark. No lights were lit, no voices, just silence. As he made his way towards his house, he noticed his wood shed. The door had been smashed and left hanging on one of its hinges, and the sturdy frame broken, as if by immense force. Inside, a 55-gallon barrel of salted fish had been ripped open, its contents strewn across the ground. But it was the footprints, abnormally large, human-like footprints, that left George speechless. The massive prints were embedded in the soft earth, leading from the shed towards the house. Each step measured nearly twice the size of George's own boot, the distance between them indicating a stride far greater than any human could manage. The depth of the prints suggested an incredible weight, pressing deep into the ground with each step. Growing up, like everyone in his family, he'd heard about the big wild men of the mountains, though he wouldn't have called it Sasquatch until after this incident. He called out for his family, then rushed through the house, looking for any sign of where they'd gone. Items of furniture were pushed aside, and things broken lay around the floor. As he moved toward the back of the house, he found the footprints of his wife and children heading off toward the river. He followed the tracks, relief washing over him when he found their trail on the sand beside the river, heading downstream with no sign of the giant creature following them. However, as he retraced his steps, he came across more unsettling evidence. Large footprints, much larger than his family's, leading up the riverbank. They came from the potato patch that sat between the house and the river, wandered around the river for a bit, and then continued back through the old field toward the mountains. The prints eventually disappearing into the dense growth and beyond. Feeling somewhat reassured that his family was safe, George returned to the house. He found further evidence when he discovered long brown hairs caught on the lintel of the doorframe, high up, above his head. The creature had to have been that tall, at the very least. George Chapman contacted the local sheriff, seeking clarity and protection. The sheriff, initially skeptical, approached the situation expecting to find evidence of a bear or another common predator. Upon arrival, the scene was more unsettling than anticipated. The sheriff carefully surveyed the area, noting the smashed woodshed door, its hinges barely intact, and a large barrel of salted fish broken open, its contents strewn haphazardly across the ground. But what truly caught his attention were the footprints. Massive, human-like impressions embedded in the earth. He crouched to examine one, tracing its outline with a gloved finger. The extraordinary size and depth of the prints suggested a creature of immense strength and weight, far beyond anything he had ever encountered. The implications of such a presence left him momentarily speechless. Acknowledging the gravity of the situation, the sheriff set about making a plaster cast of the clearest footprint. His movements were meticulous, ensuring the cast captured every ridge and contour of the mysterious track. Once the plaster had set, he removed it carefully and took it with him, assuring the Chapmans that he would delve deeper into the matter. Yet, no formal report or follow-up emerged. Rumors began to swirl in Ruby Creek that the sheriff had kept the cast for himself, perhaps unsettled by the implications of what it could confirm. And with that, the investigation stalled, leaving the Chapman family with a lingering sense of unease. Still shaken, he went to find his family, who were at the village. They were in a state of exhausted shock, but they were okay. George, determined to protect them, gathered his family and convinced his father-in-law and 2 others to come back with him, to stay in the house while he worked. Night fell, and a growing tension gripped the Chapmans. Their home, once a sanctuary, now felt unnervingly exposed. Though no words were spoken, they all felt it. That unsettling awareness that something was out there, something that refused to be forgotten. In the nights following the initial encounter, the Chapmans lived in a state of unrelenting fear. Each evening brought with it the same unsettling signs. Though the creature itself remained unseen, its presence was unmistakable. Around 2 a.m., on 2 separate nights, the usually calm dogs erupted into frenzied barking, their howls piercing the stillness of the woods. The sudden, frantic outbursts suggested that something was indeed lurking nearby, something that stirred an instinctive fear deep within them. The family endured a week of these nightly disturbances, each morning revealing the now familiar giant footprints imprinted in the soil around their home. Despite the continued evidence of its visits, the creature did not attempt to enter the house or the woodshed again. It maintained its distance, leaving the Chapmans to grapple with the psychological torment of its unseen presence. The constant vigilance wore heavily on the family, with each night stretching into a tense and sleepless ordeal. Although no physical harm came to them, the mere anticipation of another encounter with the creature was enough to drive them to their breaking point. Ultimately, the fear proved too much to bear. Unable to live under the constant threat of the unknown, the Chapmans made the difficult decision to leave their home. They packed up their belongings and moved away from Ruby Creek, never to return. So, what did the Chapman family encounter that fateful day? One unsettling detail remains: the strange, gurgling whistle Jeannie Chapman heard just before they fled. Others in the region have reported hearing the same eerie noise, and yet the truth behind it remains elusive. Whatever the cause, the Chapman's experience is just one of the many chilling chapters in the ongoing mystery of what truly lurks in the vast and untamed wilderness.